On the maps of the imagination that Americans carry in their heads, Seattle occupies a particular corner. It is the city at the edge of the continent where the rain comes sideways and the mountains rise impossibly close behind the skyline. It sits on an isthmus between saltwater and freshwater, between the Pacific inlet of Puget Sound and the long mirror of Lake Washington, pressed into a narrow strip of hills and neighborhoods that have no room to expand in any direction that does not require a bridge. To the west, the Olympic Mountains; to the east, the Cascades; to the north, 100 miles of wilderness before you reach Canada; to the south, the volcanic cone of Mount Rainier, so enormous and so close that on clear days it appears to belong to the city rather than to the mountains, rising white above the skyline like something hallucinated. Seattle is a city defined by its position at the edge of things, at the edge of the country, at the edge of the known world, and it has spent its entire existence using that position to reach farther than anyone thought it could. This is the story of Seattle. Long before any settler drove a stake into the ground on the shores of Elliott Bay, the land and water of what we now call the Seattle area was home to the Duwamish people, the Duwamish, whose name for themselves translated roughly as the people of the inside. They were a Coast Salish people who had occupied this particular stretch of Puget Sound and its surrounding watersheds for at least 4,000 years, maintaining villages along the rivers, the bay, and the lakes in a network that connected the sea and the forests and the mountain foothills in a single coherent world. At the time of European contact, the Duwamish occupied at least 17 villages, living in longhouses along Elliott Bay, the Duwamish River, the Black River, Lake Washington, and Lake Union, in communities linked by trade, marriage, and a shared understanding of the landscape's rhythms that had been developed over more generations than any European nation had existed. Their leader, known to history by a name anglicized from Sial, was a man of extraordinary intelligence and political sophistication, who understood, with a clarity that few around him could match, exactly what the arrival of American settlers meant for his people. He chose to cooperate, to counsel accommodation, to use what diplomatic leverage existed to protect as much as he could. His signature appears first on the Treaty of Point Elliott in 1855, by which the Duwamish and Suquamish ceded their lands. The city that rose on those lands was named for him. The Duwamish themselves received no federally recognized reservation and have spent more than a century seeking legal recognition from the federal government that named a city after their chief while denying their tribal sovereignty. They are still seeking it. On the morning of November 13, 1851, a schooner called the Exact dropped anchor off the shore of Alki Point, on the southwestern edge of what is now West Seattle, and 24 settlers from Illinois stepped ashore into cold November rain. They were led by 29-year-old Arthur Denny, who had traveled overland from Cherry Grove, Illinois, following rumors of good land on Puget Sound, sending his younger brother David ahead to scout. What David Denny found was wet, beautiful, and largely unfinished. When the main party arrived, he reportedly greeted them with the words, "I wish you hadn't come," a preview of the difficulty ahead. The women of the party, according to William Bell's account, sat down on the logs and took a collective cry. They called their first settlement New York Alki, borrowing a Chinook word meaning by and by, a name that expressed hope for a future that did not yet exist. It was an optimism the landscape did not immediately reward. The tides were uncooperative, the soil was thin, and the more Arthur Denny explored the eastern shore of Elliott Bay, the more convinced he became that Alki was the wrong place. In February 1852, Denny, Carson Bourne, and William Bell rowed across the bay and used a clothesline weighted with horseshoes to sound the depth of the water, finding a harbor deep enough for ocean-going ships. By spring of 1852, most of the party had relocated to Elliott Bay. The settlement they built there, around what is now Pioneer Square, became the nucleus of Seattle. They had abandoned the dream of New York Alki for something more practical, a real port on a real harbor, with deep water and timber stretching up the hillsides in every direction as far as the eye could reach. What Seattle needed in those first years was someone to buy the timber. That problem was solved in 1853 when a New York engineer named Henry Yesler arrived and built the first steam-powered sawmill on the Pacific coast at the foot of what would become Yesler Way. The mill changed everything. San Francisco was booming in the aftermath of the gold rush, consuming lumber at a rate that the forests of California could not supply. Seattle had virtually unlimited timber and a deep water harbor from which to ship it. Logs were skidded down a greased path from the hillsides above the mill directly to the waterfront, a road that loggers called Skid Road, a name that would enter the English language as a term for the kinds of neighborhoods that tend to accumulate at the edges of industrial towns. Within a few years, the sawmill had given the settlement an economic reason to exist, and Seattle began to grow. The growth was never gentle. Relations with the Duwamish deteriorated as settlers encroached on land the treaties had promised to protect, and in January 1856, warriors from multiple tribes attacked the settlement. The U.S. Navy sloop Decatur, anchored in the harbor, bombarded the surrounding hills with its cannons. The Battle of Seattle, as it came to be called, lasted a day. 2 settlers died. The Duwamish, following Chief Seattle's counsel toward accommodation, had warned the town. The episode did not interrupt the settlement's growth for long. Seattle was incorporated as a town in 1865, unincorporated in 1867, after citizens apparently changed their minds, and reincorporated permanently in 1869. By 1880, it had 3,500 people. By 1890, after the Transcontinental Railroad finally reached the city, it had more than 40,000. On June 6, 1889, a glue pot boiled over in a cabinet shop on Front Street and set off a fire that burned through 116 acres of downtown Seattle in a single afternoon. 25 city blocks were destroyed. 4 wharves were gone. The railroad terminals were reduced to ash. In a city built almost entirely of wood, including hollow logs used as water and sewer pipes, the fire had almost nothing to stop it. No one died, which seemed miraculous given the scale of the destruction, but the property damage ran into millions of dollars. What happened next became a story that Seattle would tell itself repeatedly over the following century and a half. It rebuilt. Within a year, the burned district had risen from its ashes in brick and stone, the streets had been widened, the grades had been regraded, the water system had been rebuilt underground. New rules required that all downtown construction use fire-resistant materials. In some cases, the rebuilding raised the streets so much above the old grade that the original ground floor storefronts became the underground, still accessible today on the famous Seattle Underground Tour, where visitors walk through the ghost of the 19th century city beneath the living one. The population grew by a third in the year after the fire, drawn by the construction jobs and by the general sense that a city willing to rebuild itself this aggressively was worth betting on. Seattle had already learned something that would serve it through every subsequent crisis. Disaster was also an opportunity. The gold was discovered in August 1896 in a tributary of the Klondike River in Canada's Yukon territory. For nearly a year, the world barely noticed. Then, on July 17, 1897, the steamship Portland arrived at Schwabacher's Wharf in Seattle, carrying 68 miners and what its manifest described as a ton of gold. The Seattle Post-Intelligencer had sent reporters out by tugboat to interview the miners before they docked. The story they filed, and the sight of the miners carrying their gold down the gangplank to the sound of 5,000 people on the waterfront, ignited a gold rush that ended the economic depression that had gripped the city and the nation for 4 years. Seattle was not the only possible gateway to the Klondike, but it was the closest major port. It had the deepest harbor, and it had a city government and a chamber of commerce willing to spend whatever it took to establish itself as the official outfitting destination for every prospector heading north. The campaign worked. Between 1897 and 1900, more than 100,000 men passed through Seattle on their way to the Yukon goldfields, buying their outfits, tents, tools, food, clothing from Seattle merchants who happily sold them everything they needed. The population of Seattle nearly doubled. Hotels filled, warehouses multiplied. The waterfront that Henry Yesler's mill had established became a global port handling traffic to Alaska, Asia, and beyond. The gold rush made Seattle rich, gave it a reason to believe in its own future, and established the role it would play for the next century. the city at the edge of the continent that served as the gateway to whatever lay beyond it. Seattle at the turn of the 20th century was a union town, and it wore that identity with a ferocity that occasionally surprised people from elsewhere. The shipyards along the Duwamish River had grown into one of the most significant maritime industrial complexes on the West Coast, and their workers had organized with a thoroughness and a radicalism that reflected both the region's isolation and its deep suspicion of distant authority. When the armistice-ending World War I was signed in November 1918, and the federal government's wartime wage controls still held while prices were rising sharply, Seattle's shipyard workers struck for higher wages in January 1919. The Central Labor Council voted to call a citywide general strike in solidarity. It began on February 6, 1919. For 5 days, 65,000 workers from 110 unions shut down the city. Streetcars stopped, factories went silent, restaurants closed. The strike committee organized its own food distribution, its own hospitals, its own public safety, demonstrating in a way that alarmed the city's political and business establishment considerably that workers could run a city if they chose to. Mayor Ole Hansen called it a Bolshevik revolution and brought in federal troops. The AFL's national leadership pressured the local unions to end it. By February 11th, the strike was over. It had not achieved its immediate wage demands, but it had demonstrated something that Seattle would demonstrate repeatedly, that this was a city where people believed collective action was legitimate, that the rights of workers were worth fighting for in public, and that organized dissent was not merely tolerated but was part of the city's identity. The same year the general strike ended, a young man named William E. Boeing incorporated an airplane manufacturing company in a boathouse on the shores of Lake Union. He had seen his first airplane in 1910 and had been consumed by the possibilities ever since. Boeing's first real contract came from the Navy during World War I. The company struggled through the interwar years, building boats and furniture when airplane orders dried up. World War II saved it and transformed it, and through it transformed Seattle. The demand for military aircraft during World War II was unlike anything the aviation industry had ever encountered. Boeing produced the B-17 Flying Fortress and the B-29 Superfortress in its Duwamish River plants, and at the peak of wartime production, more than 50,000 workers were employed in those factories. The company's workforce grew by more than 1,200% between 1939 and 1944. Workers came from across the country, filling the city's neighborhoods with new residents. By the war's end, Seattle had been remade, larger, more industrial, more connected to the rest of the country, and more dependent on a single employer than any healthy city ought to be. The war remade Seattle in darker ways too. In February 1942, President Franklin Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, and more than 7,000 Japanese Americans in Seattle were given days to dispose of their property, their businesses, and their lives before being sent to internment camps in the interior. Most were American citizens. Many had been in Seattle for 2 or 3 generations. The Japanese American community had been one of the backbones of Pike Place Market. Approximately 80% of the market's produce vendors were of Japanese descent, and the internment effectively destroyed that community's presence there. After the war, many Japanese American families could not recover the homes and businesses they had been forced to abandon. The city passed reparations ordinances decades later, but the loss was irreversible, and it remained one of the most serious moral failures in Seattle's history. In 1962, facing the first major recession of the post-war Boeing boom, and motivated by a desire to advertise the city to the world and diversify its economic base beyond a single employer, Seattle hosted a World's Fair. The Century 21 Exposition was a monument to the future, to science, to space exploration, to the optimistic belief that technology was leading humanity somewhere better. Nearly 10 million people visited between April and October of that year. What they found at the center of the fairgrounds was a 605-foot steel tower with a flying saucer restaurant at the top. Conceived by a hotel executive named Eddie Carlson on a napkin in a Stuttgart cafe and built in 13 months on the site of an old fire station. The Space Needle cost $4.5 million to build and became one of the most recognized structures in the world. When the fair ended, the grounds became Seattle Center, the Pacific Science Center, the monorail, the arena that is now Climate Pledge Arena, all of it descended from Century 21. The Space Needle became what no one had quite dared to predict. A symbol not just of the fair, but of the city itself. An icon as immediate and as legible as the Eiffel Tower or the Sydney Opera House. Then, in 1971, the future fell apart. Boeing's workforce, which had peaked at more than 142,000 employees in 1968, was cut to 37,200 by October 1971. The cancellation of the supersonic transport program, combined with a saturated airliner market and a national recession, produced the worst economic crisis Seattle had seen since the Depression. The joke that circulated, that a Boeing optimist brought his lunch to work and a Boeing pessimist left his car running in the parking lot, captured a mood of genuine despair. Two Seattle realtors paid for a billboard near SeaTac Airport that read, "Will the last person leaving Seattle please turn out the lights?" The sign became famous. Seattle's population fell. Houses went on sale at fire sale prices. The unemployment rate climbed towards 17%. The Boeing bust, as it was permanently named, became seared into the city's collective memory. But it also produced something useful, a recognition, finally, that a city whose entire economic existence was pegged to a single company was dangerously fragile, and that diversification was not merely desirable, but necessary. Seattle's civic leaders spent the following decade actively trying to attract new industries, new businesses, new reasons for people to come and stay. The seeds of what grew in the 1990s and 2000s were planted in the trauma of 1971. Before the tech boom and before the grunge bands, there was Jimi Hendrix. He was born in Seattle in 1942 and grew up in the Central District, raised mostly by his father in a neighborhood where the city's black community had lived since Jim Crow covenants confined them to a specific geography. He attended Garfield High School, where Quincy Jones and Bruce Lee had also been students, and learned guitar from the city's R&B tradition. The clubs on Jackson Street and in the Central District where black musicians had been performing since the 1920s in a scene entirely invisible to the white city that surrounded it. He left Seattle for the Army in 1961, then for Nashville, then New York, then London, where he became famous overnight as an electric guitarist of unprecedented power and invention. He never became famous in Seattle while he lived there. The city claimed him later, gratefully. What his story tells is not just about his individual genius, but about the black cultural world that Seattle contained within itself, a world that the broader narrative of Seattle history has always underestimated. In the 1980s, something was fermenting in the rehearsal rooms and cheap rented houses of Capitol Hill and the Central District and the surrounding suburbs of Tacoma and Aberdeen. Young musicians who had grown up on heavy metal and punk and the post-punk of British bands were combining those influences with something harder to name. The isolation of the Pacific Northwest, the gray weight of the winters, the sense that they were making music at the far edge of everything, where nobody important was watching. The independent record label Sub Pop, founded by Bruce Pavitt and Jonathan Poneman in 1988, put out records by Mudhoney and Soundgarden and a teenage trio from Aberdeen called Nirvana, and created, through a combination of genuine vision and deliberate hype, a sound and an identity for Seattle's underground scene that the world eventually decided to call grunge. When Nirvana's Nevermind was released in September 1991, it knocked Michael Jackson's Dangerous off the top of the Billboard 200 in January 1992. Pearl Jam, Soundgarden, and Alice in Chains followed Nirvana into stadiums and onto magazine covers. Rolling Stone declared Seattle the new Liverpool. Record executives descended on the city, looking for the next big thing with a desperation that made them look more lost than the bands they were signing. What had been created in Seattle's isolation was being processed through the machinery of the global music industry before anyone could quite understand what had happened. The musicians who had made the music in the first place, people who had deliberately positioned themselves as far outside the mainstream as possible, found themselves at the center of it. Kurt Cobain, who had written songs that expressed in the rawest possible terms the alienation and anguish of growing up in the margins of American life, died in April 1994. The grunge era as a commercial phenomenon essentially ended with him. While Nirvana was reaching millions of teenagers, another Seattle story was playing out in office parks in Redmond. Microsoft, co-founded by Bill Gates and Paul Allen in Albuquerque in 1975, and moved to the Seattle suburb of Bellevue, and then Redmond in 1979, became during the 1980s the dominant force in personal computing software. By the time Windows 95 launched, Microsoft was one of the most valuable companies in the world, and the Seattle area was producing a new class of wealth, not the inheritor wealth of the old families or the union wages of the aerospace workers, but the concentrated rapid wealth of software engineers and early employees who held stock options in a company that turned out to reshape the entire global economy. In 1994, a former hedge fund analyst named Jeff Bezos drove cross-country and set up a company in his garage in Bellevue, Washington. He called it Amazon and initially sold only books. Within a decade, Amazon had expanded so aggressively and into so many markets that calling it a bookstore seemed like calling the Pacific Ocean a puddle. When Amazon moved its headquarters into a former light industrial neighborhood south of downtown Seattle called South Lake Union in the 2000s and 2010s, it transformed the city with a speed that urban planners and residents alike struggled to process. Cranes rose over neighborhoods that had previously been characterized by auto repair shops and small warehouses. The population of Seattle grew by more than 20% between 2010 and 2020, making it one of the fastest-growing large cities in the United States. Housing prices increased faster than almost anywhere in the country. The city that had posted a billboard asking its last resident to turn out the lights could not build apartments fast enough. In November 1999, Seattle hosted the third ministerial conference of the World Trade Organization, and the city was flooded not only with trade delegates from around the world, but with approximately 50,000 protesters who had come to demonstrate against the WTO and the model of corporate globalization it represented. On November 30th, a coalition of labor unions, environmental groups, student organizations, anarchists, and activists from dozens of countries blocked the conference entrances and brought the downtown to a standstill. The Seattle police responded with tear gas, pepper spray, rubber bullets, and mass arrests. The mayor declared a state of emergency. The National Guard was deployed. The WTO conference collapsed, unable to reach agreement, and its director general declared the meeting suspended. The events of 1999, known as the Battle of Seattle, became one of the defining moments of the anti-globalization movement, and they said something important about the city hosting them. Seattle was a place where three of the largest corporations in America were headquartered: Boeing, Microsoft, and Amazon, and also a place with a labor tradition so deep and a political culture so genuinely left-leaning that 50,000 people could organize in the streets against the very economic order those corporations represented. The two things coexisted, uneasily and productively, as they had since Henry Yesler's mill and the general strike and the Boeing bust, and the years when Sub Pop was signing bands that no one in Los Angeles or New York had heard of. What Seattle is today is genuinely difficult to hold in a single frame. Its population is approaching 750,000 in the city proper, more than 4 million in the metropolitan area. The Cascades and the Olympics still ring the horizon. Mount Rainier is still there, appearing in the gaps between buildings on clear days, white and enormous and indifferent. The tech economy has made the city wealthy in ways that benefit some residents enormously and others barely at all. The housing crisis is real. The homelessness crisis is real. The Duwamish are still here, still seeking the federal recognition they have always been denied, still maintaining a tribal presence in the city that bears their chief's name. But Seattle has never resolved its contradictions neatly and has never needed to. It has always been the city at the end of the map, where the continent runs out, where the rain comes in from the Pacific, where the mountains press close enough to remind everyone of their proper scale. It was built by people who came to the edge of the known world and found it occupied already, who built a sawmill on a harbor they tested with a clothesline, who burned to the ground and rebuilt in a year, who outfitted 100,000 prospectors heading into the wilderness, who struck for 5 days and shut down a city, who built the planes that helped win a war and then nearly destroyed themselves when the contracts dried up, who made music in the rain that the whole world eventually heard, who coded software in garages that changed the way commerce worked, who filled the streets in protest against an economic order that was simultaneously the source of the city's wealth. That is the shape of Seattle's story. A city that has always believed it could build something worth believing in, even at the edge of everything, even in the rain, even when the last person was being asked to turn out the lights.